Okay, so we are going to go ahead and do our set of notes to wrap up Unit 4 on imperialism. And we've already talked about World War I, but now what we want to talk about is how that came to an end and how that impacted the United States. So this first slide here being kind of a review, but you do need to get it down in your notes, and that the war comes to an end. On November 11th in 1919, an armistice is signed, which is that agreement to stop fighting between Germany and the Allies. Right, so just that armistice is signed. So by the end of the war, it's really important for you to understand the impact of the war in order to understand then what was done in response to it. So these graphics here, these images show you what the amount of casualties were, and it was a staggering amount. World War I was called the war to end all wars because there were so many killed. If you look at the graphic on the left, you'll see towards the bottom the casualties for the Allies and the number wounded being over 12 million, and the total between deaths and wounded being over 22 million. And that being 39.4% of their population, just a staggering number. And then almost 8 million, and some would argue even closer to 10 million dead, if you look at the image on the right, killed in World War I. So I show you this to show you that all of these countries that come together in the peace conference afterwards have goals in mind, and the biggest goal being that they never want war again. And I want you to write that down in the left-hand side of your notes, and that World War I was the war to end all wars because these countries involved never wanted war again. They never wanted to do this again, so they took a lot of precautions to make sure that happened, and we're going to talk about what those precautions were. So the Paris Peace Conference was the conference, right? It was the very formal meeting at the Palace of Versailles in Paris, France. It was January 18th, 1919. A conference began to set the terms for peace after the war, right? So all these countries came together. All the Allied powers, 32 countries attending, came together to decide, okay, how are we going to make sure that peace lasts? The big four in attendance, of course, it was the 32 countries involved, but the big four were the main four countries, or the biggest four countries, you could say, from the Allies. So George Clemenceau from France, David Lloyd George from England, Vittorio Orlando from Italy, and Woodrow Wilson from the United States, him being the United States president. And I show you this quote to kind of show the complexity of the conference. It is much easier to make war than peace. That's from Clemenceau. And that the process to make peace in this Paris Peace Conference took a long time, and it's very complicated, and it's easier to make war, right? It's easier to fight someone than it is to work really, really hard to keep peace. So Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, is attempting to keep peace, right? He's one of the big four. He is most involved on the international level with these other countries, and so he wants to keep peace. He comes up with a plan for fair and lasting peace. So Wilson lists 14 things he believed would bring them long-term peace. Now, you don't need to know all 14 of those things, but it is important for you to know the biggest one. So his ideas for the 14 points included an end to secret treaties, right? Like the coming up with alliances and things, right? Like ending those secret treaties. We need to have transparency and everybody understand who's in agreement with whom. Freedom of the seas, and then we can't be regulating those and saying who can and can't go where, and that the seas aren't really owned by anyone in particular. Free trade, right? We're protecting people's abilities to trade with other countries. And a big one being self-determination, letting countries decide their own government and gain independence, and that we shouldn't be colonizing countries. Those countries should be deciding for themselves. Now, the 14th point is the biggest one, the biggest understanding that you have to have, and it was centered around keeping the peace. The 14th point was called the League of Nations. And so you see that sign there in the center of the slide, and then the definition off to the right. The League of Nations, being the 14th point of Wilson's 14 points to keep peace, was a general association of nations, that's like a group, that would protect great and small states alike. So make sure that you have off to the left-hand side that the League of Nations was a group of nations that work together to protect everyone. And it included this kind of clause in it, which was called collective security. Think of your squad, right? If you mess with me, you'll get my homies, right? My squad is going to have my back. And that's exactly what the League of Nations was about. And that if you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. And the idea being that that would then prevent war. That would keep peace because no one's going to want to mess with the group. Well, here's the thing. Wilson had to take his 14 points to Congress, the legislative branch of our government, and ask them to approve it, right? They can't, the president might propose it, but Congress has to be the one to sign and approve it. So you see in this political cartoon, the president marrying foreign entanglements, as it says on the bride's dress, right? And the U.S. Senate, part of Congress, comes busting in to break up this wedding. So why did Congress, and in fact they did, reject the League of Nations? You should write that down. The Congress rejected the League of Nations, but why? It's because of isolationism, and this is the biggest understanding you need to take away from these notes. Isolation, to be in isolation, right, is to be away from others. So the isolationist policy that the United States took was staying out of international alliances and affairs, a focus on things happening inside the country. And this is what Congress wanted. So this was totally contrary to Wilson's 14th point. The Treaty of Versailles was the final peace settlement between Germany and the Allies, and this was what was determined at the Paris Peace Conference. Okay, so it's important for you to know that the Treaty of Versailles is what ended World War I. Make sure you have that written down, so you can pause me right now to write that down. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I and was the agreement to end World War I. But here's the thing, the U.S. Senate, Congress refused to ratify that treaty. They refused to be in agreement with that settlement, you could say, of World War I. Their opposition, being against it, dealt with collective security in the League of Nations. They didn't want to be entangled in foreign entanglements. Senators were afraid they could get easily dragged in to another country's conflict too easily, and they didn't want war again. And finally, something called Article X, which required members of the League of Nations, if they were part of it, to come to the aid of other nations in the League when they were attacked. And here's the thing, the U.S. didn't want to do that. They didn't want to have somebody's back. They didn't want a squad because they didn't need it. They were so powerful that the United States didn't need a squad, and therefore they didn't want to have to come to the aid or protection of someone else. So Wilson's 14 points was a rough draft of the peace treaty, right? League of Nations. The League of Nations was then included in the Treaty of Versailles, which was that final peace treaty, both of them being rejected by Congress. Now, after the peace conference, sometime later in 1921 in Washington, D.C., it was called the Washington Naval Conference, where a bunch of countries came together. So in the wake of World War I, leaders in the international community sought to prevent the possibility of another war, right? So they had the peace conference and the peace treaty, but they wanted to do more than that. So between 1921 and 22, the world's largest naval powers gathered in Washington for a conference to discuss naval disarmament, meaning their navies, and disarming them, meaning reducing them, but also ways to relieve growing tensions in East Asia, mainly Japan and China. 3 of the 4 that we need to talk about are these here, and we're going to get into those on this slide. So we have the 4-power treaty, the 5-power treaty, and the 9-power. The 4-power treaty involved 4 countries, the US, France, the UK, and Japan, and they agreed to consult with each other in the event of a future crisis in East Asia before taking action, namely in Japan. Okay, so this one's all about East Asia. The 5-power treaty involved 5 powers, the same from above, but also Italy. And it was the cornerstone of the naval disarmament program, where these countries came together and said, we're going to reduce our military forces. We're not going to have as many naval battleships. The 9-power treaty involved a lot of countries, but all of them agreed to respect the territorial integrity or independence of China, which essentially means they're all agreeing that no one would colonize China because everyone wants access to that plethora of markets and the economic gain in China. The last one is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And this was a treaty between the US and a lot of other powers, a lot of other nations, providing for the renunciation or rejection of war as an instrument of national policy, and that we are not going to go to war again in order to save our butts, right? Like, we are not going to war again. So make sure that you use these notes to then answer your formative check questions. In fact, what you'll want to do is all of these power treaties, you'll want to write those in your formative check questions, including the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So if you need to rewind, you should go ahead and do that.